It's Monday, July 28th, 2008, and it's 4:20 somewhere in the world. I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville. Produced and distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C., this is your NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about our show at our website, stash.normal.org, and continue the education and conversation on our blog as well. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. The podcasting and blogging technology for the NORML Daily Audio Stash is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. For your professional web design needs, visit redaphid.com. Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to the Daily Audio Stash. Glad to have you here for the podcast. We've got a couple of great interviews coming up here for today and the next couple of days. First of all, the first part of my three-part interview with Wendy Chapkus, Richard Webb, and Valerie Corral regarding the book Dying to Get High. Now, this is a great book that's just come out, Dying to Get High, and it's about the medical uses of marijuana, specifically in California's Prop 215 and the formation of Valerie Corral's collective, WHAM, the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. So the authors, Wendy Chapkus and Richard Webb, will be talking about their book and their research, and then Valerie Corral will also fill us in a bit on the history and the current tribulations of the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. Also, a two-part interview begins today with Kevin Hoover, who's the editor-publisher of the Arcata Eye, who just recently interviewed the Deputy Drug Czar, Scott Burns, in Arcata, California, right there in the center of the Emerald Triangle in Humboldt County. And Kevin did a great job of sticking it to the Deputy Drug Czar and in his questioning continuing to come back to the idea that it's the marijuana prohibition that's the real problem in Arcata. Kevin also wants to point out the problem that has happened due to the increase in grow houses in Arcata, becoming kind of an industrial problem there. So we'll look forward to that two-part interview starting today with Kevin Hoover. Also, we've got your regular hemp headlines, and we're continuing our Pass the Stash contest, getting a lot of responses here. Our current Pass the Stash contest, you could win a copy of the DVD, a.k.a. Tommy Chong, the documentary by Josh Gilbert that chronicles Tommy Chong's 9 months in prison for selling bongs on the internet. To learn more about the contest, just stay tuned. We'll have that coming up here in just a moment. And, of course, we'll have a musical break with some great toker tunes brought to us by our friend Cannabis Carry. So everybody sit back and relax, grab yourself some OG Kush and a nice glass of milk, and sit back and enjoy your NORML Daily Audio Stash. Now it's time to take a look at the latest stories about marijuana from news organizations across America and around the world in our NORML Daily Audio Stash, Hemp Headlines. The Case for Pot, Seattle Magazine. Now, there's a great article on the upcoming Seattle Hemp Fest from Seattle Magazine. I've got a link for you at stash.normal.org, and it's got some key quotes by some of our top reformers. Vivian McPeak, the executive director of HempFest, says, quote, "People who dismiss us as a bunch of people smoking pot in the park are completely missing the point. This movement is about people losing their homes, their jobs, and their kids. Kids getting kicked out of school. People being incarcerated for an equal or greater amount of time than those committing violent crimes. It's not funny." End quote. Seattle's former police chief Norm Stamper recently recounted a story from his rookie year as a cop when he arrested a 19-year-old for marijuana possession, handcuffed him, put him in the back of his squad car, and started driving toward the station. As he looked at his charge in the rearview mirror, he realized he'd just arrested a young man who hadn't been hurting anybody. Stamper says, quote, "I could have been doing real police work. I could have been intervening in domestic violence. I could have been stopping people from hurting other people. That's noble, honorable work." End quote. And when asked why he's chosen to focus on marijuana rather than other pressing social issues, travel writer and TV celebrity Rick Steves' answer is simple. Quote, "Anybody can talk about homelessness and everyone claps, but people are afraid to talk about marijuana. I can speak out and survive. I don't need to be elected or promoted." End quote. The key to winning on this issue is to make it everyone's issue, and part of doing that is talking openly about marijuana and proudly proclaiming that there's nothing wrong with using it responsibly. That's why you'll hear me draw parallels with social alcohol drinkers. We need the average person who doesn't smoke pot to be on our side, and for that we need them to empathize with the injustices we face. Now, I had a fellow activist criticize me for that rhetoric. "You shouldn't talk about treating marijuana like alcohol because alcohol's a poison," he told me. "You're going to make people think marijuana is a killer like alcohol." Well, you're right about that, I told him. As far as marijuana being far safer than alcohol, you got no argument from me. But I have to convince people who think marijuana is far more dangerous than alcohol. And people just can't flip in a day from marijuana's evil to marijuana's good. If I can get them down from marijuana is worse than alcohol to marijuana is a lot like alcohol, then maybe they'll treat it like alcohol and legalize it. After a generation of alcohol and marijuana competing head-to-head as legal drugs, people will naturally move from marijuana's a lot like alcohol to alcohol is worse than marijuana just by observing the evidence. See, people need a hook. We're trying to get them to imagine something that doesn't exist. If we can match it to an established pattern that does exist, a social intoxicant that is taxed, controlled, and regulated, it'll be easier for them to imagine. Arkansas group wants to decriminalize marijuana. An advocacy group in northwest Arkansas is doing its best to decriminalize marijuana, making a pot violation much like getting a parking ticket a slap on the wrist. The group is called Sensible Fayetteville, and members are trying to make marijuana crimes the lowest possible priority for police. They argue that Washington County is wasting taxpayer dollars by prosecuting people for weed. They say instead, police should focus on property and violent crimes. Campaign manager Ryan Denham said, quote, "Here in Arkansas, we spend $30 million a year to arrest people and prosecute people for small amounts of marijuana, and we believe there's way more important things to focus on." End quote. Now the group is trying to get an amendment on a municipal ballot this fall. To do that, they need 36,000 signatures from Fayetteville voters. City by city, state by state, this is how we erode the support for marijuana prohibition from the bottom up. There are far too many entrenched bureaucracies and corporate interests at the federal level to expect any serious action on marijuana law reform. Without strong public support, there's no compelling reason for any of these federal politicians to stick their necks out for relegalization. When enough states and cities pass medical marijuana and decriminalization bills, though, the feds will find that the ground has shifted beneath them, and the reforms we see today as impossible will by tomorrow seem inevitable. Conflicting marijuana laws take stage in California medical marijuana trial. From the Los Angeles Times. A highly anticipated trial involving conflicting marijuana laws got underway Friday in Los Angeles federal court, with a prosecutor painting the owner of a Morro Bay medical marijuana store as a brazen drug trafficker who sold dope to teenagers and toted around a backpack stuffed with cash. Defense attorneys struggled to provide context for their client's alleged crimes after being barred by the judge from mentioning the phrase medical marijuana. At the center of the case is Charlie Lynch, a 46-year-old businessman from San Luis Obispo County, who opened a facility called Central Coast Compassionate Caregivers in the spring of 2006. Lynch's defense attorneys would like to present evidence that their client was dispensing doctor-prescribed medical marijuana to sick people in accordance with state law and with the blessing of elected officials in Morro Bay. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has concluded that federal drug laws trump those of the state, and that the reasons why the drug is distributed are irrelevant. But one of Lynch's lawyers hinted during opening statements that Lynch had sought, and presumably received, approval from an official with the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration before he set up shop. If they are able to convince U.S. District Judge George Wu that there is a sufficient basis for mounting such a quasi-entrapment defense, they may be allowed to present evidence that Lynch believed he was operating within the law, which legal experts said would likely make him more sympathetic to jurors. In previous federal medical marijuana cases, defendants have been forbidden to mention that they were growing medical marijuana for sick people in accordance with California law. When the juries have convicted these people, shortly thereafter, the jurors are then approached by the media, asking how they felt about the harsh sentence they just handed out to a medical marijuana provider. Then these jurors become angry that they weren't told the truth about the case, and almost always they say they would never have voted to convict if they'd have known it was for medical marijuana. It's truly bizarro world when your government can charge you with a felony, then prevent you from raising a defense. I understand that the Raich v. Gonzalez decision affirmed the supremacy of federal law over California's Prop 215, but I still don't understand why that means you can't even mention medical marijuana in court. Let's say I robbed a bank. When I'm caught and go to trial, my defense is that L. Ron Hubbard appeared to me in a dream and told me bank robbing was not only legal, but my duty to take the money of the rich and give it to the poor. Now, that's not going to be a valid defense for bank robbing, but would the government forbid me from bringing it up? Certainly the judge could instruct the jury on the federal statutes against bank robbing, and could instruct them that even if they are sympathetic to my fevered imagination and altruistic intent, that they still have to decide the case based on federal law. Why does that not apply to medical marijuana? Why can a person not submit their reasons for committing the crime, whether that's belief in dreams or adherence to state law, in federal court? Why can't the judge instruct the jury that California's Prop 215 is not an acceptable defense to federal law? I'll tell you why. Because every time the federal government is forced to talk about medical marijuana, they're losing. If a federal prosecutor had to press a case involving lengthy prison sentences and massive fines against a defendant the jury knows to be a medical caregiver, that whole stalwart defenders of wholesome society facade comes crashing down, and they're seen as the brutal, vindictive, reefer-mad prohibitionists who don't care how many sick and disabled people are crushed beneath the wheels of their drug war juggernaut. European engineers using hemp to make greener cars. From The Engineer online. Low-carbon motoring usually conjures ideas of energy-efficient engines, alternative fuels, or electric cars. But although the powertrain forms a large part of the car's carbon footprint, it is not the whole story. The embodied energy in the vehicle, the energy and associated carbon that goes into making the car and its component materials, is also a small but significant proportion. A recent study by Volkswagen estimated that almost a third of a car's carbon footprint comes from its manufacture. These figures do not include the energy or carbon needed to make the steel or the electricity used in the factory. Finding new, lower-energy materials is a target of research projects across industry and academia, and some striking results have now started to appear. At the Warwick Manufacturing Group, Ben Wood recently led a project to produce an eco-racing car made as far as possible from natural materials. Starting with a steel tubular space frame, his team added side body panels made from a composite of hemp matting, impregnated with a resin based on rapeseed oil. The Cornwall-based boat builder EcoCats provided the main body panels, made from a resin based on cashew nut shell oil. Fueled with a blend of 15% unleaded petrol and 85% bioethanol, the Eco 1 car has a higher power-to-weight ratio than a Ferrari Enzo, can do 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4 seconds, and has a maximum speed of about 150 miles an hour. Wood's goal was to prove that cars built from and fueled with plant-based products need not be slow and lumbering. He said, "My goal is to make a car that's 95% biodegradable or recyclable." While the Eco 1 is a research project sacrificing looks for performance, Its ideas have been taken up in a slicker way by Lotus. Now on show at the British International Motor Show's Green Motoring Pavilion is what looks like a standard model of the Elise, until you look closer. Instead of the usual leather-clad interior, the seats, door panels, and gear stick are swathed in a tweedy-looking wool, and the carpets are made from sisal, a variety of hemp long used to make durable matting. Other materials are also derived from nature. The body panels, like those of Eco 1, are a composite reinforced by hemp rather than glass fiber. That was a great way of reducing the carbon footprint of the car because the hemp is grown locally, which cuts down on transportation, and of course, hemp fixes CO2 as it grows, said Lee Preston, environmental manager at Group Lotus. And it's also lighter than glass fiber. We achieved a 10 to 20% reduction in gas usage, said Preston. That's likely to be the biggest thing we've learned from this project to be carried over into production, although we're also very encouraged by the results we have had from using hemp. Henry Ford's first cars used hemp in much the same way as these engineers, and Rudolf Diesel invented his engine to run on hemp seed fuel. After almost a century, automakers are finally returning to their hemp roots.
Now it's time to play Pass the Stash, where you can win cool prizes from NORML.
Hey Stashers, time for a brand new Pass the Stash contest. This one's going to run all the way through the end of July, so you've got till July 31st to get your entries in to stash@normal.org. Here's the contest, and it's inspired by a conversation with a friend of mine, Scott, from Herb Age Designs. Check them out at herbagedesigns.com. And we were talking about what's the smallest amount you've ever heard of anyone being busted for marijuana, the smallest amount in possession. And Scott had quite a surprising answer. I'm not going to give it away yet because I want you guys to enter. So the person who can prove to me that they were busted with the smallest amount of marijuana in grams or less than a gram, just send me an email at stash@normal.org and you could win a copy of the DVD, aka Tommy Chong, the Josh Gilbert documentary that chronicles Tommy Chong's 9 months in prison that he served for selling bongs on the internet. If yours is the entry with the smallest amount and you can prove it by July 31st, you'll win the DVD. We'll just mail it right out to you. You can remain anonymous and you must be 18 or over to play. And thanks for playing Pass the Stash.
Hello, I'm Paul Stanford from the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation, or THCF. Medical marijuana is legal in 12 states today, and THCF has medical clinics in 6 of those states. Our physicians help qualified patients obtain an authorization for medical marijuana in their state. Patients are eligible for medical marijuana with a history of either severe chronic pain and or nausea, cancer, AIDS or HIV, hepatitis, glaucoma, seizure disorders like epilepsy, chronic muscle spasms as in multiple sclerosis or asthma, neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, and gastrointestinal disorders like IBS or Crohn's disease. If you or someone you know has one of these conditions, our doctors will help them obtain a permit for medical marijuana. THCF Medical Clinics has offices in Washington State, Oregon, Colorado, Nevada, Hawaii, and California. Call 1-800-723-0188 or go to the web at www.hemp.org or 1-800-723-0188.
Well, the success of California's Proposition 215 is one of the landmark successes in the battle to end adult marijuana prohibition, especially for those people who are sick, dying, or sense-threatened that can really use the medical benefits. But it hasn't been an easy battle, and along with us here today, I'm joined by Wendy Chapkus and Richard Webb, who are the co-authors of the new book, Dying to Get High. We're also joined by Valerie Corral, who's with the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana, which the book does do a lot of description of and their history. So to the three of you, thanks for joining us here on the Daily Audio Stash.
Pleasure.
Well, let's start with Wendy. Wendy, in writing this book, the reviews that I've read of it said that it details a little bit about how marijuana has been a medicine recognized throughout history for many, many years. And so what is some of that history and what did the people face in trying to get this recognized again as a medicine?
Well, what was very interesting to me in studying the history of the criminalization of cannabis was that it was widely used not only as sort of an alternative medicine, but it was included in many drugs that you would get at your local pharmacy until the 1930s. And then it was sort of swept up in the Anslinger early drug war, I think partly as an attempt to smear immigrants from Latin America and urban African Americans, but also just as a way to demonize drugs, as another tool towards demonizing drugs. And then finally, it was removed from the pharmacopoeia, but patients and some physicians knew that cannabis and cannabinoids had therapeutic properties and continued to use it informally, and by the 1970s started to demand that it be available, rescheduled, that is, so that it could be available for medicinal use. As you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, cannabis is listed in the most restrictive category of all drugs, so that it is, by definition, a drug that has no medicinal value, despite scientific evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, and now you are a sociologist at the University of Southern Maine, and sociologically speaking, how does this continue? How do the forces come together that keep marijuana in this Schedule I category when there seems to be so much popular support and medical support for the medical uses of marijuana?
Well, again, I think it's become a victim to the drug war because marijuana is the most commonly used drug for recreational purposes. If you start to chip away at the notion that marijuana is an evil substance, you start to diminish the rationale for the drug war itself, and it's a hugely expensive bureaucracy at work here. So it threatens the entire drug war, I think, if you remove marijuana from the sort of center of that war. And I think the medical use of marijuana makes clear that this drug isn't the devil in disguise, and starts to open up a conversation about the kind of extreme politics that are involved in maintaining a war on drug and drug users.
Yeah, it's a friend of mine is fond of saying that medical marijuana is the crack in the wall of ignorance. And I want to turn to Richard now. Richard Webb works in communication studies at San Jose State University, and he's another co-author of this book, Dying to Get High. And Richard, from a communications perspective, we see so many of these ONDCP ads that tout these negative effects of marijuana and this propaganda against marijuana. How were the people involved in California's Prop 215 how were they successfully able to communicate their message of the medical use of marijuana in the face of this huge drug war budget of propaganda against it?
I think that's one of the most interesting things, really, that we talk about in the book. And the fundamental issue here, I think, is the notion of shared need. I think when the people in advancing Prop 215 were advertising it on television, they made some great rhetorical choices. My parents, I remember when I first approached them with the discussion of this subject, who were quite conservative and very opposed to drugs, when it was presented to them as a matter of sick people need this, they really understood that. And more, all of us are confronted by the fact that if we ourselves don't fall ill, someone that we know or someone that we love and care about is at some point bound to. And for terrible diseases like cancer and for difficult treatment regimens that accompany all kinds of different diseases, people's need becomes a unifying factor. And from the point of view of communication, I'm very interested in how we as collectives and as a society in the whole come to collective agreement about what things mean or what our basic assumptions about the world really should be. And one of the things that lends itself very greatly, I think, new collective agreements or new perceptions of shared need. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. I think that it's the frame that marijuana resides within that makes it so difficult. And part of what medical marijuana did was to change the frame of the argument. And I think that's definitely a valid point. Now, Wendy and Richard, if I could ask here, between the two of you, as you were researching and doing this book, did you start already with a high level of knowledge about the medical marijuana issue? Did you learn anything new as you were putting the book together?
You want to start, Rich?
All right. My friends, when they discovered this was my topic, laughed and said, "Oh, you're uniquely qualified to investigate such a subject." I have known cannabis users for most of my adult life and have from time to time used it both recreationally and have self-medicated with it. And I also have had a long-standing personal and academic interest in what I refer to often as renegade social groups that are interested in exploring social alternatives that are somewhat outside the norm. And so I had actually read some of the literature on cannabis and cannabis culture, knew people throughout my life actually that used it, occasionally some people who dealt it. So I can't claim to have been an expert on the subject of cannabis or certainly on medicine, but I was a little bit familiar with some of that stuff. What I was quite unfamiliar with was a real understanding of what it's like to be really, really sick and really, really poor. And that's huge in this book, Russ. I mean, what WHAM is about is providing free marijuana not to people who can afford it, but for people who might die without it. And that was what I really learned about, was that notion of how bad people's needs can be when it comes to illness and poverty.
And Wendy, how about you?
Well, for me, most of my previous research has been on gender and sexuality issues, and my last book was on prostitution politics. So what I found when I first started looking into drug policy, and particularly into the prohibition of marijuana use, was how similar it is to prohibitions on prostitution. The notion that participants have to be protected from themselves, from their own bad behaviors by arresting them and imprisoning them. The idea that it's a morals issue, not a health issue, and so forth. And also the notion that you can approach a problem like this as a criminal problem. The U.S. is one of the few remaining industrialized countries in the world that sees drugs and sex that way. Most places look at it as a public health issue. So that was, for me, an immediate hook. It was like, I've heard these arguments before, and they didn't make sense to me when I was looking at prostitution politics, and they don't make sense to me when I'm looking at drug politics. But more directly, I was living in Santa Cruz, California, where WHAM is located, and I was part of the community that supported Valerie Corral and Michael Corral when they were arrested for growing a few plants to treat Valerie's epilepsy. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This was before there was a medical marijuana law in California. But I thought it was ridiculous to be arresting patients whose doctors believed that using cannabis would help alleviate their symptoms. And so I sort of became a political activist around the issue before I became interested in it as a scholarly issue. And like Rick, found it an absolutely compelling story as I got more involved. Being involved with the people who are WHAM members transformed my experience of living in the United States in the first few years of the 21st century. I mean, I found this to be a terrifying time to be living in the United States. The government response to anything that threatens it seems to be increased surveillance, arresting people, and everything down the line through imprisoning them, in detention situations with no legal recourse, and torturing and everything else. And I think it's very understandable that many people have found it so terrifying that they have backed off, shut up, retreated into their own private personal lives. And what I found with the members of the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana is here you had people who were living in the most extreme conditions. I mean, people who were facing death, who were living in extreme poverty. And they were taking on this most powerful government on the planet right now in a very open way and refusing to be terrified into submission, refusing to shut up, refusing to back down. And I found it incredibly inspiring. So for me, I think what I learned was that I could have mentors in the patients who are involved with WHAM. These are people who are incredibly courageous, and they allowed me to be more courageous.
My interview with Wendy Chapkus, Richard Webb, and Valerie Corral continues on tomorrow's Daily Audio Stash, with Valerie Corral describing the history of WHAM and detailing the challenges that WHAM faces in providing medical marijuana to qualified patients. Hi, I'm Russ Belville, the Associate Director of Oregon NORML, a chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm proud to announce the release from Oregon NORML of the Oregon Medical Marijuana Act Handbook. This is the definitive guide for the patient, caregiver, or grower in Oregon trying to learn the ins and outs of our medical marijuana program. The guide answers common questions from how do I register with the state to use cannabis medicinally, and what are the possession limits regarding plants and medicine, to questions like what do I tell my landlord or the police about my medical marijuana, and what if my doctor won't help me with a marijuana recommendation. The handbook also contains a complete copy of the Oregon Revised Statutes governing medical marijuana. For your own copy, check out our website at ornorml.org. Here at the NORML Daily Audio Stash, we work hard to change our nation's marijuana laws through education and discussion. But we also take time to relax and unwind with an eclectic mix of pod-safe music from many independent artists. We look for music that speaks to the growing truth about cannabis, or music that speaks to broader themes of freedom, liberty, social justice, equality, and protest. To find out more about the artists and download the music you hear on this podcast, just log on to stash.normal.org. And if you'd like to get your music heard by the online cannabis community, just send us an email at stash@normal.org. Welcome to Blue Monday, Stashers. Turning to alcohol because there is no safe cannabis available is certainly a subject for the blues. Today, Rex P. Clem gives us his take on these kinds of blues with his song, The Weed Is What I Need. Indiana-born Rex P. Clem began his musical career performing in the local honky-tonks of his central Indiana home at the age of 13. He has shared the stage with some incredible players, writers, and singers, some well-known and some that should be. Rex has opened shows for country artists such as David Allan Coe, Vince Gill, Brad Paisley, Reba McEntire, Holly Dunn, Lee Greenwood, and has worked with artists like the Marshall Tucker Band, Blackfoot, and Molly Hatchet. Rex now lives in the songwriting mecca, Nashville, Tennessee. A bluesman with his roots in country music, he continues to play on numerous sessions, as well as writing and pitching songs of his own. He plays music and teaches bass guitar in Nashville. Visit his MySpace page for more great music from this country bluesman, and you can find that link at our website, stash.normal.org, where you can also get a download of the MP3 of this song. It's Rex P. Clem with The Weed Is What I Need.
Jim Beam in the morning, Jack Daniels at night. Sometimes need a little vodka, make me feel alright. Lately I've been drinking the Captain's Parrot Bay rum, but I just called my dealer, said, man, you gotta get me some, cause the weed is what I need. The weed is what I need. All this liquor's gonna kill me, cause the weed is what I need. First time that I tried it, I was a much younger man, and now I wanna do it anytime that I can. Some folks think it's bad, well, I think that they're wrong. Hell, I like it so much, I just had to write this song, cause the weed is what I need. The weed is what I need. All this liquor's gonna me, 'cause the weed is what I need. Oh, give it to me, man. If you're feeling bad, just listen to me. I've got the answer for your relief. Don't drown in that whiskey, don't swim in that rum. Just roll a fatty and smoke it till it's gone. 'Cause the weed is what I need. The weed is what I need. All this liquor's gonna kill me, 'cause the weed is what I need. Yeah, the weed is what I need. The weed is what I need. All this liquor's gonna kill me, 'cause the weed is what I need. All this liquor's gonna kill me, 'cause the weed is what I need. Oh yeah, that's what I need, all right.
It's tough talking to kids about marijuana, especially if you might be a parent who dabbled a time or two in your youth. So to help you out, get your copy of Dr. Mitch Earlywine's latest book, A Parent's Guide to Marijuana. Dr. Earlywine is an associate professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and an expert on the studies concerning marijuana, its effect on health and society, and the methodology behind the statistics. He is a frequent guest here on our daily audio stash. Dr. Earlywine lays it all out without the propaganda and scare tactics that parents know won't work with teenagers. He presents a rational understanding of cannabis, what it is and what it isn't, and why kids shouldn't be using marijuana. You can order today through Amazon.com or check our links at our blog, stash.normal.org. Well, we've been following the story of the Deputy Drug Czar's visit to Arcata, California, and the newspaper that published his interview was the Arcata Eye, and I'm very happy to be joined by Kevin Hoover, who's the editor-publisher of the Arcata Eye in Arcata, California. And Kevin, welcome to the Daily Audio Stash.
Hey, thanks, Russ. Glad to be here.
Hey, so let's set up for our listeners a little bit about how this came to be that the drug czar would be, or Deputy Drug Czar, Scott Burns is his name, would come to visit Arcata, California.
Sure, it's a real long story going back really decades to Arcata's sort of tradition. We're thoroughly enmeshed with the colorful cannabis culture. Going back to, a lot of people have seen the Humboldt Honey poster.
Right, you're in Humboldt, California, Humboldt County, right?
Yeah, we in Garberville would have to be like the co-capitals of the Emerald Triangle, I'd have to say, by popular perception. Arcata was the first town, I think, in the United States to have medical cannabis licenses. Our police department would issue, so that if you were walking down the street smoking, the cop says, "Hey, what are you doing?" You could flash the license and go, and they'd just say, "Okay." And so that was in '98. So we, in Arcata, this situation evolved where we have a lot of dispensaries, and we have a real strong infrastructure for cannabis and widespread acceptance of medical cannabis. I'd say near 100%, as far as I can tell. And we've tried to pioneer means by which patients can have safe access. And I think that there's a fairly relaxed attitude towards recreational use, too, and, of course, Humboldt State University and so forth.
Sure.
Unfortunately, some kind of destructive phenomena began to crop up, so to speak, which is the grow houses, which any given one, is not a problem necessarily, but when you have whole neighborhoods sort of become these industrialized enclaves, a lot of people we've had the price of housing, as you know, is going up or has been kind of exclusionary for
students can't rent a room in Arcata. It's getting worse because of so many rooms displaced for growing. I mean, it's become an actual phenomenon where the plants are living in the houses and the people are living in the street.
Yeah.
And then in a lot of neighborhoods, too, people are literally surrounded by grow houses. And as much as we might be sympathetic to cannabis in all levels, certainly it's no fun to lose all your neighbors. You have people who don't talk to you, and their houses, their windows are closed up, and basically neighborhoods their values are going down. So neighbors started getting active. We started doing stories. The national media picked it up and came here. A lot of people have thought that we've invited them. Not at all. They read the paper as much as we do. They're always looking for stories, and everybody wants to come to Humboldt County and see the redwoods and so forth.
Sure.
Literally, some of these reporters, they come here, they do their story, and then they go off on the Avenue of the Giants and down the coast and see the sights and stuff. So they did that, and with all the publicity, I suppose it wasn't long before the administration thought that they had a nice little poster child for drug abuse.
Aha.
They showed up. That's it in a nutshell, Russ.
Okay. Now, you were talking about how there's a strong cannabis infrastructure there in Arcata and that area. What do you mean by that? Just businesses, or?
Oh, yes, indeed. We have 4 cannabis dispensaries, medical cannabis dispensaries, with varying levels of medical screening. Some you can just walk in and with a photocopied recommendation and buy a nug. Others are, they want to see that you're terminal, they want to see your doctors, they want to talk to your doctor and everything. There's 4 of those. There's, 4 or 5 hydroponic shops to service all these grow houses, and the legitimate Prop 215 grows in homes for the patients. And, then, of course, there's the head shops, and then there's all the grow houses, too.
Mm-hmm.
So quite well developed.
I guess so, yeah. So I imagine this pumps a lot of money into the local economy then.
Absolutely. Okay. It does, and that's one of the millions. I mean, that's one of the points that the dispensary operators have made. We're presently in the midst of planning commission hearings, because the city perceives this as a land use issue. Basically, if you turned over homes to any given kind of, industrial activity,
right.
My comparison is Starbucks. What if Starbucks came to town, started buying up houses and turning them into roast houses? They're not, but if they did, you'd have some of the same issues. You'd have basically homes turned into industrial enterprises. You might have the smell and so forth like that. Well, the Planning Commission right now is looking at ways to do a very difficult thing, Russ, and it's really trying to thread the needle. It's a very cutting-edge kind of field of law. We desperately want to protect the right of access for Prop 215 patients. Nobody wants to interfere with that. On the other hand, what we don't want is homes being purchased by people from out of the state for the simple purpose of converting them to little pot factories and killing neighborhoods. So what do? It's very cutting edge. It's very controversial. There's a lot of very impassioned rhetoric. People have certainly strong feelings. And we also want to protect our tradition here of tolerance. So how do we do all that stuff? It's rough.
Yeah, and it seems to me like I think you put it very well. Is that this is like a zoning issue? It's not that anyone here is necessarily against the marijuana establishments. Obviously, like you said, it's pretty well entrenched in the Emerald Triangle area. It's more that out-of-state interests. If it was any, like you said, large business that was coming in there and destroying neighborhoods. So the drug czar sees this. The drug czar's office sees this, Office of National Drug Control Policy. They send out the deputy drug czar, Scott Burns, and I imagine they don't see it as a planning and zoning issue.
No, if you read the interview, he's pretty adamant that the whole thing is wrong, and that's their line, and they are sticking to it. He would not give an inch, not a centimeter, not a molecule on that. I asked him, how can you really justify having marijuana as a Schedule I drug, like heroin? And, it has to be there. You kind of got to, I don't want to characterize his views because I don't really understand them. So I would urge people to read it for the interview for themselves and piece it together. it's kind of a study in I think in a way brain chemistry or psychology or something. I mean, as you know, two people can look at the exact same situation, whether it's this or a car accident or a painting, and see two absolutely different things. And this is an object lesson in that, how people will take a situation and sort of data mine it to reinforce their predispositions. That's what I got out of it. I was just, when I left the interview, I was just really disappointed that they couldn't acknowledge that there are chemotherapy patients who this is the only thing that has given medical cannabis lets them have an appetite and suppresses their nausea and gives them some semblance of a quality of life. That to me is unassailable. It's just a physical fact. I know people who have relatives who are suffering, and this helps them. And they're not stoners. They're not Harold and Kumar. They're just regular people. They might be middle-aged, conservative people, and this is what works for them. But we don't get that acknowledgement by the powers that be.
Yeah, and we've got a link to that interview, by the way, up at our blog at stash.normal.org. And I kind of broke down the drug czar's argument into basically a dozen talking points that were all, each one more ridiculous than the next. But what I thought you did a really good job in the interview is keeping on the theme that it's not the marijuana that's the problem, it's the prohibition of the marijuana that's the problem. To the point of the grow houses, if this were a legal, taxed, and regulated industry federally, there would be no profit for out-of-state people to come in to take advantage of. It would be like any other business that could be, sensibly regulated.
The best way I can sort of animate that argument for folks is that if we did still have prohibition, what we would have is still houses. Mm-hmm. We'd have people operating stills and making gin in their garages and bathtubs and stuff, and then we'd be facing the same thing at City Hall. What's also something that I'd like your listeners to consider, Russ, is that a lot of the people who are doing this, using these grow houses, they're kind of hiding behind, and I think tarnishing Prop 215 a little bit. I think it's fairly cynical, because I've talked to some of them, and they don't all sell to dispensaries. They just they'd go down south and sell it. So they're making a lot of money. There's a big profit motive, and for those folks to sort of hold up, people who have a genuine medical problem, I really have an issue with that.
Yeah, and that's why I've always stated that the medical marijuana issue is the stepping stone to the eventual end of all adult marijuana prohibition, because until we make it to that point, you're always going to have a black market running alongside this medical marijuana market, and they're going to tarnish. That tarnish is going to happen. The profit motive's too strong. So that's why we're here at NORML, continuing to fight for all people, healthy or sick, to be able to use this and to get it taxed and regulated sensibly here, so that we could avoid some of these situations like this issue with the grow houses. Our interview with Kevin Hoover from the Arcata Eye concludes on tomorrow's Daily Audio Stash. Thank you for downloading the NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. We are produced by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. Our executive producer is Alan St. Pierre. Our deputy director is Paul Armentano. Our webmaster is Brian Judy, and web production is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. As always, you can catch up on the latest information about marijuana at www.norml.org. And you can interact and download from our Audio Stash blog at stash.normal.org. For everyone here at NORML, I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville, hoping all your harvests are bountiful and your encounters with law enforcement are non-existent. We leave you today with another one of our cannabis quotes, this one from the beloved Hollywood actor and silver screen cowboy, John Wayne, who once said, quote, "There's been no top authority saying what marijuana does to you. I really don't know that much about it. I tried it once, but it didn't do anything to me," end quote. So the Duke tried some weed. Well, that's good to know, and it's good to know that it didn't do anything to him. And you know what? It's not doing anything to most of the people that are using it. Most of the people that use marijuana use it responsibly, occasionally, and have no problems in the rest of their life, other than the fact that the marijuana is illegal. We've got to end this adult marijuana prohibition. There's no way that we should be treating so many millions of our citizens as if they were criminals. Thanks for joining us on the podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow with part 2 of the interviews that you heard today. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.